This is the makeup video for youth ministry at St. Peter's on February 19th and St. Mary's on February 26th. If you didn't attend class one of those 2 days, then watch this video, reflect on it, think about it, and then up here there should be a link to a PDF document. Open it up, answer the questions in it. They're based on this video. Turn them into me. If your answers are satisfactory, then if they're acceptable, you get credit for the class. Yay. Alright, so what do we talk about? We talked about revelation. Divine revelation. What is it? Well, what is a revelation? It's when something is revealed to you. And so, what is divine revelation? Well, it's when God reveals himself to you. Revelation is the process, the how of how God revealed himself to us. The very fact that we know about God is through revelation. Now, how did people get to know who God was? How did revelation come about? It comes about when people have experiences of God, or people reflect and think about who and what God is. So there's 3 basic ways that we come to know about God. 1, a person just looks around in the world and says, man, this world is this way and not that way, and they reflect on this. For example, think of how ordered the entire world is. Everything is ordered. There must be something that ordered it, something that created it. There has to be. Everything comes from something. Well, what's the ultimate something that everything came from? So we can start to understand things about God. These are types of revelations about God. In nature, God has hidden these little nuggets of wisdom that teach us about him, that share with us things like God is eternal. God is the creator of all things like that. Then there's a second kind of revelation, and this is when God comes down to reveal himself to us. Think of Moses in the burning bush, when God came down in the burning bush to reveal himself. All right. This kind of takes on 2 forms of revelation now. So God comes to people, and then those people tell the story to other people of what God did. And this is passing on revelation. This is an oral tradition. People tell the story, and they keep telling the story. Moses tells Tim, and Tim tells John, and John tells Steve, and Steve tells Jill, and Jill comes to learn what God told Moses through this unbroken chain of oral tradition. Now, somewhere in the oral tradition of the Jewish people, people wrote down the stories. Now, maybe Moses wrote down the stories himself, or maybe Jill wrote down the stories, or maybe Tim, somewhere in between. But at some point, these stories were written down, collected, and formed the Old Testament. So this is another way that we receive the revelation of God, not just through this oral tradition, but through the Bible. That's the Old Testament. Now, to help you understand better the way revelation works, think about it in terms of a friendship. So, when 2 friends get to know each other, what do? They spend time with each other, they talk to each other, they share little pieces of themselves with each other. Think of the small talk, where they share little bits, maybe about their childhood or their hopes and dreams for the future or whatever. And these pieces of small talk where they just simply hang out with each other, they grow in their friendship for each other. That's how it worked with God in the Old Testament. He shared himself bit by bit with the Israelites. He revealed more and more of himself to them so that their friendship could grow. So we can see that God's revelation is analogous. Really, a friendship is analogous to God's revelation. A friendship helps us understand how God reveals himself. It's very similar. Now, think about it. As 2 friends get to know each other better and better and better, better and better, better and better, and it's a guy and a girl, they fall in love. And they decide to get married, and then one day they do get married. Now, there's a huge difference between being married and being friends. Because when you're friends, you share parts of your life with your friend. You'll spend time together. You'll take this day to be with them. You share pieces of your life story with them, in random times. But marriage is different, because marriage is not simply sharing part of your life with someone. It's sharing your entire life with someone. You're not just giving part of yourself. You're not just revealing some parts of yourself. You give your entire self in marriage. We're going to come back to that. But I want to lay that as the foundation for our lesson. Now, Revelation keeps on building up. Sorry, I'm moving my papers around. Revelation keeps on growing in the Old Testament. People learn more and more and more about God. Now, in Jesus Christ, He is the ultimate revelation of God. He is the fullest revelation of God. There will be no greater revelation given than Jesus Christ. Actually, there's going to be no more revelation about God given than what Jesus Christ gave to His apostles. So, why is Jesus the fullness of this revelation? Well, think about it. Revelation is learning about God, learning about who God is, God revealing Himself to us. So the best way to get to know God, the best way to understand God, is to meet Him. Just like the best way to know a friend is to meet Him in the flesh. So in Jesus, we meet God in the flesh. And that's how we can, develop and grow in our relationship with Him. And so in Christ, we meet God. We don't just learn about God. We don't just talk about God. We meet. We experience God. There is no fuller revelation of God than actually meeting God. That's what we do with Jesus Christ. That's why He's the full expression, the fullest revelation, I guess, of God's revelation. Sorry for the redundancy. Now, I want to kind of take this again and with our analogy. In a marriage, you give your entire life to your friend. You don't just share parts of your life with your friend, you share your entire self. The same is true here with God. In the Old Testament, God shared bits and pieces of Himself. In the New Testament, in the age of the church, God gives His entire self. He gives His entire self. Jesus comes down, God comes down, and gives Himself completely on the cross for our salvation. He reveals His love completely where? On the cross. On the cross. So think about it. Why is God revealing Himself? Well, why do you get married? To be in a marriage, to love a person, because you love them and you want to be with them forever. Well, so too with God. He loves us and wants to be with us forever. And so, what did He come down? He came down to marry us. That's what He did. That's what Jesus is all about. He gives His life. Just like in marriage, the spouses give their lives to each other. But there's a problem here. The problem is this. When did Jesus Christ give Himself completely to us? On the cross. And we're saying that this is the marriage of Jesus Christ. This is Jesus Christ's marriage. When He gives Himself completely to His bride, which is the church, us. But here's a problem. Where's the church? If you want to get married, both people have to be present. Both people have to give themselves to each other. But all we have on the cross is simply God giving Himself. But there's nobody giving themselves back. At least that's what it looks like on the surface. To really understand this, you got to understand the Last Supper and how the Last Supper relates to the cross. This is the fullest revelation of God. So how does this all relate? Well, think about the Passover. The original Passover comes and the people are being set free from Egypt. Pharaoh won't let the people go, and so God gives them the 10th plague because 9 plagues wasn't enough. And so God finally sends the 10th plague, the death of the firstborn. And this plague is what will set the Israelites free. Now, this plague, again, the death of the firstborn, this is going to happen to everybody in Egypt, animal and human alike. How do you get out of it? How do you save yourself? How do you be saved from this terrible, terrible fate? The Passover sacrifice. That's how you're delivered. And so the Jews had to, the Israelites at the time actually, they had to sacrifice a lamb. This is the Passover lamb. They sacrificed a lamb, spread its blood on the doorpost, and then had to eat the lamb. And through this sacrifice, God set them free. Pharaoh said, "Get out of here," and they walked free, and none of them died. The Passover lays the foundation, if you will, for Jesus' death on the cross. It gives us an understanding of it. Now, there's something important about the Passover we need to mention here. Whenever people celebrated the Passover, they celebrated as if they are the ones being delivered from Egypt. There's a question in the Passover that's posed by the youngest to the leader of the Passover meal sacrifice. And they ask, well, why do we do this? Something like that. And the answer is for what the Lord did for me. Is what the Lord did for me in setting us free from Egypt. Now, this is the wordage that's used even for people thousands of years removed from the Exodus. People who weren't there when the Israelites were freed from Egypt, and yet they still say, why do we do this? It's because of what the Lord did for me. Why? Because somehow spiritually they're transported back to the Passover sacrifice. So the Passover meal, the Passover sacrifice that people celebrated in Jesus' day, was somehow a participation in that first sacrifice. So that's the background of the Last Supper, because the Last Supper is a Passover sacrifice, the Passover meal. And how did the Passover meal work? Well, in the first century AD, it opened up with a cup of wine. There's 4 cups of wine that kind of give you a structure for the celebration. So first cup of wine is drunk by everybody, and that opens the celebration. They read from the book of Exodus, and then read Psalm 113. They eat bitter herbs this time. Now, they read Exodus, they read about the slavery that happened. Why would you eat bitter herbs when talking about slavery? It's because slavery is bitter. So that's the reminder there. And then they drink the second cup of wine. Everybody shares that. And then they pass around the unleavened bread. Now, this bread is the bread that Jesus changed into his body in the Last Supper. Then after that, they eat the lamb. After this, they have the third cup of wine that's passed around to everybody. This is the blessing cup. This is the cup that Jesus changed into his blood. After this, they sing 5 psalms. Psalms 114, 115, 116, 117, and 118. This is this great hymn that is sung. And then the celebration is ended with a final cup of wine. This final cup of wine is kind of like the climax, the high point of the liturgy of Passover. It's kind of like analogous to communion. It's the high point of the Mass. All right, so the Passover meal that is the Last Supper is recorded in the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And what we find here is that Jesus opens the celebration. Everything goes on as normal, except for the fact that when he talks about the bread, he says, "This is my body." And then when he talks about the blood, "This is my blood of the new covenant." But then he says something interesting. He says, "I'm not going to drink of the fruit of the vine anymore, not until the kingdom comes." Why is this interesting? Because after Jesus consecrated the third cup into his blood, he says, "I'm not going to drink the cup anymore until the kingdom comes." What's the high point of the Passover liturgy? The fourth cup. But he's saying, "I'm not going to drink it." And indeed, that's exactly what happens. After consecrating the third cup as his blood, they sing this great hymn, and then immediately they don't drink any more wine. They go out. They go out to the Garden of Gethsemane, and Jesus' passion immediately begins. And he's arrested. He's condemned. He's beaten. He's scourged. He has the crowning of thorns. He's condemned to death. He carries his cross. He goes to Calvary. And he's dying on the cross. And right before he dies, what's he say? He says, "I thirst." Excuse me. Sorry about that, no pun intended. I had a dry mouth. Anyways, Jesus is dying on the cross. And he says, "I thirst." Why would he say that? Well, think about it. Let's go back to the Garden of Gethsemane. What's he pray? "Father, take this cup from me." What cup is he talking about? The cup of his suffering, yeah. But what if it was the fourth cup? Think about that. Because now come back to Jesus dying on the cross. Right before he dies, he says, "I thirst." And what's at the bottom of the cross? A bowl of wine. Sometimes it's translated vinegar. There's a bowl of wine at the bottom of the cross. And so what happens? Jesus drinks this wine. They put a sponge on the edge of some hyssop, which was used. Hyssop was used in the Passover liturgy. And they dip it in the wine, give it up to him, and he drinks it. He drinks the fourth cup. That completes the Passover sacrifice. Immediately after that, he says what? It is finished. What's finished? The Passover. The new Passover is finished. The Mass, it's finished. And he bows his head and dies. And so just like the original Passover was both a sacrifice of the lamb and a meal, so too is Jesus' new Passover. So too is Jesus' new Passover. This is Jesus' wedding day. Remember, this is where Jesus gave himself up completely. That's his wedding day. His wedding day is his death when he dies on the cross for us. But we still have the problem. Okay, so the Last Supper and Jesus' death on the cross are the same thing. Okay. But Jesus is still missing a bride. This is where that little piece about the Passover, oh, it's eternal. This is where this comes in. So even you could be 1,000 years removed from the original crossing the Red Sea and the Passover sacrifice. But you would still say, why do you celebrate it? Because of what the Lord did for me. What the Lord did for me. This happens every time we celebrate Mass. Every time we celebrate Mass, we are going back to the original Last Supper. We're not just remembering the Last Supper. We're going back to be a part of the Last Supper. And if we're going back to be a part of the Last Supper, then we're also going back to be a part of the cross. So who was there with Jesus on that cross? All of us in the church on that cross with Jesus, giving ourselves back to the Lord. So who is Jesus? He is the ultimate revelation of God. Jesus is the ultimate revelation of God who doesn't just share pieces of himself with us. He shares his entire life with us. He gives his entire life to us. So how do we respond to that? We give our entire lives back to God. We give our entire lives back to God. That's the response. Do that in Mass. That's what Mass is about. Giving ourselves entirely back to God. So think about it. When you receive communion, this is God giving his entire self to you. Take that as a moment. When you receive communion, you're not so much receiving him as much as he is receiving you. And let that be the moment where you give yourself completely to him. And every time you celebrate Mass, renew that commitment to the Lord, where you give up your entire self to his glory.